mounds and potholes just with aerial photos. So we asked ourselves a few years ago, well, how much of this stuff do we actually have left? Is there enough to worry about? Is there enough to try to see if we can conserve some of this? And the short answer is yes, and I'm not going to present a lot of this data here, just briefly. This is a map that we did in conjunction with, we're getting a lot of competition over there, aren't we? Well, they're just listening to what we hear and what I'm saying, and they have another take on it, I guess. They're really having a good time. So we did this map with HGAC. I don't know if you know who HGAC is. They're the Houston-Galveston Area Council. We asked that question, can we map this out? So they had some highway money to do this. And it wasn't so much, if it was from the planning council there at HGAC. So it wasn't so much that they funded it because they wanted to preserve the stuff. It was because they wanted to know, well, where would there be less fights? What areas could we avoid, right? So what we did is we looked at aerial photographs around the area, and we decided that we would only map those areas 100 acres and more, right? And we've got a lot of grief for this from a lot of people over the years. Well, why didn't you map the 2-acre places and the 1-acre places? Well, because we didn't have enough money. So folks who don't have a feel for what mapping involves are the ones that criticize us usually the most. If you start mapping 5 acres over this 8-county area, it would take a long time. 100 acres, in other words, you can pull back and map stuff a lot quicker. And it turns out, if you look in the literature, that 100 acres is about a good size in terms of the habitat, in terms of sustaining the kind of fauna that we still have. So that's why we did that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. This is coming out in Site magazine. How many of you are familiar with Site, the magazine of the Rice Design Alliance? Maybe it's this week, maybe next week. It's going to be a centerfold. How about that? I never thought that I would actually be part of a centerfold and a pinup. And it's actually going to be in the centerfold. You can take it out and you can pin it up and look at those glorious pimple mounds. They're wonderful. But the point I want to make here is that yes, there is still some great stuff out there. There's some big pieces, not just little pieces. There's some big pieces out there, okay? But it is going on our watch. So when I say big pieces, I'm talking tens of thousands of acres of unland-leveled areas, okay? This is a unique and special resource that have never been land-leveled, okay? Much of it has, nothing really has pristine vegetation, but much of it has great vegetation and could be easily restored. So this is what's before us, and there's some areas. I think this area here, for example, what I'm calling the Columbia corridor, the Columbia bottomlands there. There are prairie potholes, there are forests. So we looked at both forests and prairies in this. Again, I don't want to spend a lot of time. It's just to say, yes, we have lost. We've lost an unconscionable amount. We've lost too much, and we continue to lose. But there's enough for us to be engaged. This could be the fight of our generation, to save this stuff, because it's still valuable, but it is going quick. The Grand Parkway is making its way around. I don't know if you've noticed that or not, okay? And where there's roads, what happens? Now, some people say, well, roads don't kill prairies, people do. Well, okay, but you put that road in there, you're aiming the gun at the prairie. So we just did a little analysis of this the other day. We looked at all the prairie pieces in terms of how much acreage is out there. So the acreage from 100 to 500, from 100 to 500 acre pieces, there's 132 pieces of prairie, and that's 37,000 acres. Well, that's pretty good. But look on the other side over here, pieces greater than 10,000. It's almost half of what's left. Each of these pieces, from here on up, is 10,000 acres each piece. At least 10,000 acres. Some of them are 30 to 50,000. Some of these pieces are close enough to eat together that you could make a 70,000 acre piece. That's real habitat. That's something for the future that we need to talk about. Now, you've all heard of the famous Deer Park Prairie, right? It's wonderful. 50 acres, $4 million. Now, people, and I was in favor of that. People could argue and say, well, $4 million, 50 acres, let's see, out a little farther, maybe that could have bought about 1,000 acres. Well, maybe so. But to me, it was a heartening piece of news, because it means at least there's somebody that's interested in giving $4 million for some acreage. So hopefully if we can transfer that now to some of these kind of areas, that will be very valuable. The other thing that we were playing with, you all know one prairie, right? Which is the Katy Prairie. That's the only prairie you've ever heard of. And that is so important to have a name, right? Because when you say, oh, we got to save a prairie, well, it's the Katy Prairie. Well, why don't the other prairies have names? Actually, they did used to have names, and we can put names on them. So what we're calling the Karankawa Prairie has prairie pimple mound complexes that beat the crud out of anything that the Katy Prairie has, because most of the Katy Prairie has been land leveled. There's still some great work for them to be done, but there's tremendous pieces down, especially along our southern flank. So we've just played with this. These aren't official names. One day we'll hold a contest or something. But they need to have names. We need to take ownership. You can't take ownership unless you can name something. So we need to name the prairies. We need to name our forests too. Why not? All right, what about what's been lost? That was the other piece that we were looking at here. I got to get moving here a little faster. We have lost a whole lot, let's just put it that way. And most of the loss is centered in Harris County. Over 30% of the prairie pothole wetlands that were there in 1992 have been lost since 92. That doesn't account for what was there before. 35%. That's mind-boggling. That should be shocking. And most of it unmitigated. We shouldn't tolerate that. These are valuable and important areas. And that story is going to be told in the other counties where development is fast proceeding. Brazoria County, Fort Bend County, Montgomery County, Buku forested wetlands. Most of that loss unmitigated. So this is, we're about to publish this work. It's just all in sort of layout and editing at Texas A&M right now. But this, again, this is sort of this piece of the puzzle. What's the lack of enforcement? How much have we lost? What kind of mitigation is going on? So the final thing here, before I actually get to the Trendmaker case, this idea of the nexus. How connected are these wetlands to the waters of the U.S.? Now, the waters of the U.S. is it's a sort of a legal term. It just means it's an official, the U.S. exerts jurisdiction there. So is there a nexus? Well, that's the question that we've all had. For many years, those of us that work in the field, we see water coming off of the wetlands. I know when the Bayport thing was going on, some of my colleagues would take the core out and they'd say, well look, there's water coming off of this. Well, that's not good enough. That's anecdotal, because all I can do is see it. So it can't be good enough, right? Well, you got to have some kind of science. So science means rigor, science means observation. So that's what we decided that we would be doing. So I just repeat that again. So this is what we would see coming off. So this is the situation in these kind of what I'm going to call headwater wetlands. The wetlands farthest up in the landscape, where there's not a easy to see connection, especially when it's dry. So these pictures are taken when it's really wet. This is Andy Sipix. Some of you may know him. This is in the Armand Bayou Nature Center. So actually, we're losing. It's even worse. You could, if the light weren't so bad here, you could see a little bit better. But if you kind of look where he's standing, you can see how you can kind of see it's pretty wet as you come down to this little bit of open water. So these are what we call these poorly defined swells in the very upper part of the watershed. Well, you'll have a pothole, and then coming out of that pothole will be these swells. Sometimes these swells would actually be, in the area where the old channels ran through. So it's hard to see. And these areas will be wetland, the Corps would agree. Yes, they're wetland. They have the wetland hydrology, the wetland vegetation, and they have the soils. They say, oh yeah, that's fine, that all meets it. But we don't think that the water from these wetlands makes it out of these potholes into the waters of the U.S. And as a point of clarification, they say, well, could happen every once in a while, but as a matter of course, in most years, in normal years, it's not going to make it out. These are closed depressions. Yeah, maybe every once in a while you get some toad floater and the water gets out. But most years, no. Okay? So, and then this is what it looks like as you come down the watershed a little bit. Starts to get a little more defined. The Corps would still say, no, this is not sufficient. This is not a connection. We don't recognize this. You come down a little further. This is still what we would call a poorly defined swell. Okay? The Corps wants something like this. So when you get this far down, this is the same little place. You have what they call a bed and banks connection, an ordinary high water mark. Now they would say, yep, if that wetland is immediately adjacent to that, we'll regulate it. If not, forget it. We're not going to regulate it. So what we did was we set up an experiment, an observation point, to measure in these wetlands, in the forest there at Armand Bayou Nature Center. Let's see how much water is going in. So we have a rain gauge out there. How much water goes into the wetland, okay? And then we set up what we call a weir, which is just a piece of metal that you can see right, well, let's see, I'll just use this deal. You can see that right there, okay? At the point, you know, this problem is it's hard to measure, so we have to go down far enough that we can get a weir in the channel, such as it is, so that we can actually measure that water. So here is Andy. Andy Sipix helped us set all this up, and then I had a couple of colleagues from A&M come down, and in fact, a young student actually got his master's thesis on this and is about to defend. So there's the weir, and because of the way that the weir is a V-notch weir, there's a data logger right here that measures the height of the water. And so given that we know the geometry of that V-notch, we can tell how much water comes off of that system. We have a rain gauge. We know how much water is coming down. We have the watershed measured. So we know how much water is coming down, and we know how much water is leaving. It's called a water budget. It's pretty simple. Here's the results. Water comes in. It doesn't always go out, but it's kind of a fill and spill effect. So sometimes if there's enough water, it fills up and spills out. Okay? And so you can see the rainfall events there. These are 3 years. I think we had 4 years of data. Some of these years were normal. One of them was drier than normal. I don't remember which one it is because after 2011, we didn't think anything was drier than, that was the year that was drier than normal. So it looks like maybe 2008 was a little drier than normal. And then if we summarize that data, and I'm not spending a whole lot of time on this, but on average, over the 4 years that we looked at it, okay, not abnormal years, some were a little wetter, some were a little drier. We're not talking about toad floaters here. 17% of the water that came in went out of those wetlands and into the waters of the U.S. That water, when it enters those wetlands, is materially affected, impacted by those wetlands. It is cleaned up. So behind us came Baylor University, completely independent. In fact, we were a little bit torqued because they got the money that we thought was ours, that by all rights should have been ours. But they didn't give it to us, and we weren't happy about that. And so we didn't collaborate very well with those people. So that's good because that meant they operated on their own. Actually, they're wonderful people. After all, we got to know them. They was good. But we, why are you getting this money? Okay? But that turned out to be great because it's completely independent. So we did one place. They did 10 or 12. And guess what they found? The same number. 17 to 20% of the water that comes in goes out into the waters of the U.S. And they did a separate study, not just the hydrology, they actually quantified the cleansing power of those wetlands. This is measurement. This is not, arm waving. They took measurements. And they found that of the water, 99% of the nitrogen coming in, of the total nitrogen coming into the wetland, was cleaned up before it went out, so that the water going out of the wetlands, we have a lot of crud in our air here, right? So it picks up nitrogen on its way in, that cleaned them up on their way out, okay? Now, I'm not saying this data is perfect, but this is pretty solid stuff. It's published in a reputable scientific journal. Wetlands. That means other scientists have to look at it. And if they think they don't necessarily have to agree with everything, but if they look at it and say, well, were you at least rigorous? Did you do what you should have done? Baylor published in this journal as well, okay? So, and there are critics out there, but you've got to, the way we have conversations is, you do science. You say, well, I don't think you're right. Well, then you come out and try it too. But here's 2 independent studies, and I mean independent, and we came up with incredibly the same number. So that should tell you something. All right, comes now Trendmaker, a wonderful company, not a bad company at all, but they have the serious misfortune of having chosen a site that is right next to 2 of the study sites that were done. It's not their fault, they didn't know. We were just waiting for someone. We laid that trap. We didn't really, but they came by, so we've got Baylor not even a mile, just west, or just east of Ellington Field. And then the study that we did at the Armand Bayou Nature Center may be, as the crow flies, 2 or 3 miles at the most. So here we have this data, right here. And here's this humongous prairie pothole complex. This is a very interesting prairie pothole complex. It's one of the last great pieces in Harris County. Certainly in southeast Harris County, it is the last significant piece. It's 2,000 acres. So it's not as big as those guys farther out, but in terms of where it is, it's quite significant. Actually, it's quite close to the 50 acres.